Welcome to Story Planet, where we bring you calm and cozy tales to help you unwind. Tonight's story is called Winter's Quilt, a heartwarming journey of love, family, and memories stitched together. So settle in, feel the warmth of your favorite blanket, and let this gentle tale wrap you in peace and comfort. Close your eyes, relax your mind, and let yourself drift into the world of Evelyn and Clara. Now let's begin. Snowfall and Stitches. The wind howled gently outside the small countryside cottage. Flurries of snow brushed against the frosted windows. Inside, the world was quiet. Only the soft crackle of the fireplace broke the silence. The warmth of the flames flickered over the room. A golden glow danced on the walls, adorned with faded photographs. Shelves filled with books lined the cozy space. Evelyn, a graceful grandmother with silver hair, sat in her favorite armchair. Her hair was neatly tied into a bun. Her knitting needles clicked softly in her hands. On her lap rested a bundle of fabric. It was the beginning of a quilt that would tell its own story. Across from her, Clara, her teenage granddaughter, sat cross-legged on the plush rug. She was flipping through a book, but her gaze kept wandering. The snowstorm outside had trapped them in for the night. The power was out, leaving them reliant on the comforting glow of the fire. Clara's eyes flicked to the quilt forming under Evelyn's skilled fingers. Finally, she spoke. "What are you working on, Grandma?" she asked softly. Evelyn paused her knitting. She looked up, her eyes twinkling with warmth. "A quilt, my dear," she said. "But not just any quilt. This one will hold stories." Clara tilted her head, intrigued. "Stories?" she asked. "How can a quilt tell stories?" "Every patch has a memory," Evelyn explained. "As I sew each piece, I weave in a tale from my past. By the time the quilt is finished, it will be like holding a piece of my life in your hands." Clara leaned forward, captivated. "Can you tell me one of the stories?" she asked eagerly. Evelyn chuckled softly. "Of course, my dear," she said. "Let's start with this one." She picked up a square of pale white fabric. It reminded her of fresh snow. "This patch," she said, "reminds me of winters from my childhood, back when the world seemed so big and everything felt magical." Clara wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. She settled in, ready to listen. "When I was your age," Evelyn began, "we lived in a small farmhouse on the edge of a forest. Winters were long and cold, but they were my favorite time of year. The trees would be wrapped in blankets of white. The air was so crisp it almost sparkled. My siblings and I would wake up early on snowy mornings. We'd peek out the window to see the ground covered in fresh powder. Those mornings were pure adventure. We'd bundle up in layers of mismatched scarves and mittens. My mother knitted every one of them herself. Then we'd race outside before breakfast. The best part of those mornings was making snow angels. We'd find a patch of untouched snow, lie down, and sweep our arms and legs back and forth. The shapes would form around us, and we'd laugh until our cheeks turned pink. The cold would seep through our clothes, but we didn't care. Evelyn paused, her smile soft and warm. The memory seemed to glow within her. "But there was one winter," she continued, "that stood out more than the rest, the year of the snowstorm of the century." Clara's eyes widened. "What happened?" she whispered. "Oh, it was magnificent," Evelyn said. Her voice carried a note of awe. "The snow fell for 3 days straight. It piled higher than the fences. We were snowed in, just like we are now. At first, we thought it would be dreadful. Stuck inside for so long, we didn't know how we'd pass the time. But then, my mother had an idea. She gathered us all around the big wooden table in the kitchen. She pulled out her basket of fabric scraps. She taught us how to sew that winter. Each of us made a patch for a quilt. We stitched in whatever patterns and colors we liked. Mine was a pale white square, just like this one. I sewed a little snowflake in the center, inspired by the storm outside. As we worked, my mother told us stories from her own childhood. She talked about the winters she had spent in that house. She shared the games she played and the lessons she learned. It felt like we were stitching together not just fabric, but also connections to her past. Evelyn's voice softened. She looked at Clara with a gentle smile. By the time the snowstorm ended, she said, we had made a quilt. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. Every patch had a memory, just like this one will. Clara sat quietly for a moment. The stories sank in like warmth from the fire. She imagined her grandmother as a young girl. She could see the laughter and hear the stories of that snowy winter. That sounds wonderful, Clara said finally. Do you still have that quilt? Evelyn nodded. It's upstairs in the cedar chest, she said. Maybe one day I'll show it to you. I'd love that, Clara said, her smile bright. Evelyn resumed her knitting. The soft click of needles filled the room once more. Clara returned to her spot on the rug. Her book lay forgotten as she watched her grandmother work. Outside, the snow continued to fall. It wrapped the cottage in a cocoon of quiet. Inside, the warmth of the fire and the magic of shared stories created a world of their own. One stitch at a time. The market's melody. The morning after the snowstorm, the world outside the cottage seemed to glow. Fresh snow blanketed the fields, and icicles hung from the eaves, catching the soft light of the rising sun. Clara sat at the kitchen table with a steaming mug of cocoa, watching as her grandmother prepared another patch for the quilt. Evelyn held up a square of bright blue fabric. Its color reminded her of the clear skies of spring, a time when the snow had long melted and the world was alive with movement and sound. She ran her fingers over the fabric, her eyes distant. This one, she began, reminds me of my days at the town market. I must have been about your age when I first started helping my parents there. Clara looked up from her cocoa, her curiosity piqued. What did you sell at the market, Grandma? Evelyn's lips curved into a gentle smile. Scarves, my dear. Hand-woven scarves my mother and I made together. The market was always so lively, filled with colors, scents, and music. It felt like stepping into another world. Evelyn's memory carried her back to the cobblestone streets of the old market square. Stalls were lined with goods, baskets of fresh produce, jars of honey, and bolts of vibrant fabric. The air was rich with the aroma of freshly baked bread and roasted nuts. Her family's stall was nestled between a spice vendor and a flower seller. Their scarves hung in neat rows, catching the sunlight in shades of deep crimson, forest green, and sky blue. Each one was a labor of love, woven with care and dyed in colors that reflected the changing seasons. The market was more than just a place to sell things, Evelyn explained to Clara. It was a meeting place, a hub of stories and connections. I met so many fascinating people there. One day, a traveling musician set up near their stall. He was a young man with a worn violin, his case open to catch coins from passers-by. He played tunes that seemed to carry the essence of every corner of the world, lively jigs, haunting ballads, and melodies that lingered long after the notes had faded. Evelyn's mother had been skeptical of the musician at first. He's just trying to earn a quick coin, she'd said. But Evelyn was captivated. The music felt like magic, a thread weaving through the market that tied everyone together. I couldn't help but hum along, Evelyn told Clara with a chuckle. One day, he caught me singing quietly as I worked. He smiled and tipped his hat, and I must have turned as red as the scarf I was holding. What happened next? Clara asked, her cocoa forgotten. Well, he started playing psalms just for me, Evelyn said, her cheeks coloring slightly even now. Or at least it felt that way. Whenever he played a tune, he'd glance my way and nod, as if sharing a secret only the music could tell. Evelyn's father had eventually invited the musician to their stall for tea. His name was Theo, and he spoke of faraway places he had seen on his travels. He told stories of bustling cities, quiet villages, and the changing landscapes he'd passed through, each one inspiring a different tune. He taught me that music can hold memories, Evelyn said, just like this quilt. One spring afternoon, as the market buzzed with life, Theo played a tune that Evelyn had never heard before. It was soft and lilting, like a gentle breeze on a warm day. "This is for you," he'd said when the song ended. "A melody for the girl who sings while she works." Evelyn's heart had swelled with a mix of shyness and pride. That melody stayed with her, lingering in her mind long after Theo had packed up his violin and moved on to the next town. Clara's eyes sparkled as she listened to the story. "Did you ever see him again?" she asked. Evelyn shook her head. "No, but I didn't need to. His music stayed with me, just like the memories of those market days. Every time I hum that tune, it feels like he's still playing it, right here in this room." She looked at the blue fabric in her lap and began sewing it into the quilt. "Music has a way of connecting us to places and people, Clara, just like this quilt will connect you to me." Clara nodded, feeling the weight of her grandmother's words. She watched as Evelyn's hands worked deftly, stitching the fabric into place. The blue square seemed to glow against the other patches, as if carrying the melody of a violin with it. Outside, the snow glistened under the pale light of day. Inside, the warmth of the cottage wrapped them in a cocoon of stories, each stitch binding them closer together. The quilt grew, one piece at a time, carrying with it the memories of a life well lived. A garden in spring. The snow outside the cottage began to soften under the warming touch of the late afternoon sun. Inside, the fire continued to crackle, its gentle warmth radiating through the room. Clara sat curled up on the couch, a blanket draped over her shoulders. Her eyes followed her grandmother, who was carefully selecting a patch of green fabric from her basket. "This one," Evelyn said, holding up the soft, verdant square, "reminds me of the first garden I ever tended. It was my little sanctuary, a place where I learned patience and saw life blossom under my care." Clara straightened, intrigued. "Was it a big garden, Grandma?" Evelyn chuckled. "Not at all, my dear. It was no larger than this very room, but to me it felt boundless. It was the first place that was truly mine." Evelyn's memory drifted back to her youth, to a spring that was brighter and greener than any other. She was 16 and had just moved with her family to a cottage on the edge of a meadow. The cottage was surrounded by untamed land, dotted with wildflowers and bordered by a lazy stream that whispered as it flowed. "My mother noticed how much I loved wandering through the meadow," Evelyn began. "She suggested I start a small garden of my own. At first, I thought she was joking. What did I know about planting things? But she handed me a trowel and a packet of seeds, and that was the beginning." Evelyn had chosen a patch of earth near the cottage, a spot that caught the morning sun. She cleared the ground with determination, pulling weeds and turning the soil with her hands. Her mother watched from the kitchen window, occasionally stepping out to offer advice or encouragement. "The first seeds I planted were daisies," Evelyn said with a smile. "Simple, cheerful flowers that always seemed to be smiling back at me. I remember being so impatient, checking the soil every day to see if anything had sprouted." Clara giggled. "That sounds like something I would do." "Patience doesn't come easily when you're young," Evelyn agreed. "But that garden taught me to wait, to trust that the earth would do its work in its own time. And one morning, when I least expected it, I saw the first tiny shoots poking through the soil. I felt like I'd uncovered a little miracle." As the weeks passed, Evelyn's garden began to flourish. The daisies bloomed first, their white petals gleaming like tiny stars. Then came the marigolds, their golden hues brightening the edges of the garden. She planted vegetables too, carrots, beans, and a row of tomatoes that her father claimed were the sweetest he'd ever tasted. "But the garden wasn't just about growing plants," Evelyn continued. "It became a place where I could think, dream, and find peace. Whenever I felt overwhelmed, I'd go out to my little patch of earth and lose myself in the rhythm of weeding, watering, and watching the world grow around me." One afternoon, as Evelyn tended her garden, her mother joined her. Together they planted a row of lavender along the border, their hands working side by side in the rich soil. Her mother shared stories of her own childhood garden, of the herbs and flowers her grandmother had taught her to grow. "We weren't just planting seeds that day," Evelyn said. "We were planting memories, creating a bond that would stay with me long after the garden itself was gone." Clara sighed softly, her imagination painting a vivid picture of the lush, vibrant garden her grandmother had described. "Do you think I could grow a garden, Grandma?" she asked. Evelyn's eyes sparkled. "Of course, my dear. A garden doesn't have to be big to be meaningful. Even a single pot with a flower or herb can bring you joy. It's not about the size. It's about the care and love you put into it." She began stitching the green fabric into the growing quilt, her hands moving with practiced ease. "This patch will remind us both of the beauty that comes from nurturing life, of the quiet magic that happens when we take the time to grow something with our own hands." The green square found its place among the others, its color vibrant and alive. Outside, the snow continued to melt, hinting at the promise of spring. Inside, the cottage was filled with the warmth of shared stories and the steady rhythm of creation. The quilt grew, one patch at a time, carrying with it the essence of Evelyn's life and the lessons she hoped to pass on to Clara. The quilt of friendship. The wind outside had quieted, leaving the world blanketed in a serene silence. The warmth inside the cottage seemed even cozier as Evelyn picked up a vibrant patch of golden fabric from her basket. Clara noticed how delicately her grandmother handled it, as though it held something precious. "This patch," Evelyn began softly, "reminds me of a night when friendship truly stitched itself into my heart." She smiled at Clara, her expression both wistful and bright. "Let me tell you about my dear friend Lila, and a quilt that changed everything." Clara leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. "Was she your best friend, Grandma?" Evelyn's smile deepened. "Oh, yes. Lila was as much a part of my life as the air I breathed. We grew up together in the same little town, inseparable from the day we met. We shared secrets, dreams, and laughter. But it was one winter night that truly bound us together forever. It had been a bitterly cold evening, and the town was quiet under a heavy layer of snow. Evelyn and Lila were huddled in Evelyn's small room, surrounded by scraps of fabric and a single flickering oil lamp. They were 16, and their hearts were set on finishing a quilt for a neighbor who had fallen ill. "Mrs. Callahan was the kindest woman," Evelyn explained to Clara. "She used to bake cookies for all the children in the neighborhood and always had a kind word for everyone. When she fell ill that winter, the whole town seemed to lose a little of its warmth." Lila had come up with the idea to make Mrs. Callahan a quilt, something warm and beautiful to keep her spirits up. Evelyn had eagerly agreed, and they'd spent weeks collecting fabric scraps from neighbors and stitching them together in secret. The quilt was a riot of colors, each patch unique and vibrant, much like Mrs. Callahan herself. "We worked late into the night," Evelyn said, her voice soft with memory. The lamp's light cast long shadows on the walls, and the room was filled with the sound of our laughter and the steady rhythm of the needle and thread. Lila was the better seamstress, but she never made me feel like I wasn't good enough. We were a team, perfectly in sync. The cold seeped through the walls of the house, but the warmth of their determination kept them going. Evelyn remembered how they shared stories as they worked, recounting silly moments from their childhood and dreaming of the futures they hoped to build. "By the time we finished," Evelyn said, "it was nearly dawn. We held up the quilt together, exhausted but exhilarated. It was the most beautiful thing we'd ever made. We wrapped it up and delivered it to Mrs. Callahan that very morning." Mrs. Callahan had been overwhelmed with gratitude. Evelyn could still picture the way her eyes lit up when she saw the quilt, her frail hands running over the stitches. She said it felt like a hug from the entire town. Evelyn said, her voice catching slightly. That quilt was more than just fabric and thread. It was love, stitched into every square. Clara's eyes were wide, her hands clutching the edge of her blanket. What happened to Lila? She asked softly. Evelyn's smile turned bittersweet. Lila moved away a few years later, but we always stayed in touch. Even now we write letters to each other. She's far away, but whenever I think of her, I feel that same warmth from all those years ago. She began sewing the golden patch into the quilt, her hands steady and sure. Friendship is like a quilt, Clara, she said. It's made of different pieces, shared moments, kindness, and care, all stitched together over time. It keeps you warm even when you're far apart. Clara nodded, her heart full of the story. Do you think I'll have a friend like Lila one day? She asked. Evelyn's eyes sparkled. I have no doubt, my dear, and when you do, cherish that friendship. Tend to it just as you would a garden or a quilt. It'll grow stronger with every stitch. As the golden patch found its place among the others, the quilt seemed to glow a little brighter. Outside, the snow-covered town lay in peaceful stillness. Inside, the warmth of Evelyn's stories wrapped Clara in a sense of wonder and hope. Together, they continued to build the quilt, one memory at a time. A winter romance. The fire crackled softly, filling the room with warmth as Evelyn picked up a square of deep red fabric from her basket. Clara watched her grandmother's expression shift, a tender smile playing on her lips as she held the patch delicately. This one, Evelyn said, her voice as soft as the fabric in her hands, reminds me of the first time I met your grandfather, Henry. It was a winter evening, not unlike this one. And, oh, what a story it is. Clara sat up straighter, her blanket falling to her lap. Grandpa Henry? I've always wondered how you met him. Was it romantic? Evelyn chuckled, her cheeks flushing slightly. Oh, my dear, it was more than romantic. It was magical. Evelyn was 22, and the town was abuzz with excitement over the annual winter dance. It was held in the grand old barn at the edge of town, which was decorated with strings of twinkling lights and garlands of evergreen. Snow blanketed the fields surrounding the barn, shimmering under the moonlight. I wasn't sure I wanted to go, Evelyn admitted. I'd never been much of a dancer, and I was perfectly content spending the evening at home with a good book. But Lila insisted. She said I couldn't miss it. That night, Evelyn had worn a simple dress in shades of burgundy, her hair pinned up with a sprig of holly. She'd felt shy as she entered the barn, the sound of laughter and music washing over her. Couples twirled on the makeshift dance floor, their movements as graceful as the falling snow outside. And that's when I saw him, Evelyn said, her eyes sparkling at the memory. Henry was standing near the refreshment table, looking as out of place as I felt. He was new to town, you see, and didn't know many people yet. But there was something about him, something that made me feel like I'd known him forever. Evelyn hadn't planned to speak to him, but fate had other ideas. As she made her way toward a group of friends, she'd accidentally bumped into Henry, nearly spilling her cup of cider. I was mortified, Evelyn said, laughing softly. But Henry just smiled and said, if all introductions were this memorable, the world would be a brighter place. They'd struck up a conversation, discovering they shared a love for books, winter evenings, and quiet moments by the fire. Henry had a way of making Evelyn feel at ease, his gentle humor and warm smile melting away her nerves. Before I knew it, Evelyn continued, he'd asked me to dance. I was hesitant at first, worried I'd make a fool of myself, but he insisted, and I'm so glad he did. They'd stepped onto the dance floor as a slow waltz began to play. Evelyn remembered how light she'd felt in Henry's arms, as though the rest of the world had faded away, leaving only the two of them. Snowflakes drifted past the barn's wide windows, catching the glow of the lights and adding to the magic of the moment. We danced for hours that night, Evelyn said, her smile growing wistful. And by the end of it, I knew he was someone special, someone who would change my life forever. Clara sighed dreamily, her cheeks resting on her hands. That's the most romantic story I've ever heard, she said. What happened after the dance? Oh, Henry was nothing if not persistent, Evelyn said with a chuckle. He started visiting the town more often, always finding reasons to stop by the library where I worked. Sometimes he'd bring me a book he thought I'd like. Other times, it was just an excuse to chat. We'd go for long walks in the snow, talking about everything and nothing. He had a way of making even the simplest moments feel extraordinary. As Evelyn began sewing the red patch into the quilt, she said, "This square represents that winter, the season when Henry and I found each other. It's a reminder that sometimes the most beautiful things happen when you least expect them." Clara watched her grandmother work, the steady rhythm of the needle and thread weaving the story into the fabric. "I hope I meet someone like Grandpa Henry one day," she said softly. Evelyn looked up, her eyes shining with love. "You will, my dear. And when you do, you'll know. Love has a way of finding us when we need it most." Outside, the snow began to fall again, tiny flakes swirling in the evening breeze. Inside, the fire burned steadily, its glow reflecting off the quilt that was slowly coming to life. Each patch, each story was a testament to a life filled with love, laughter, and cherished memories. The storm that strengthened. The fire in the hearth crackled gently, casting flickering shadows across the room. Evelyn reached into her basket and retrieved a square of dark gray fabric. Clara watched as her grandmother's fingers brushed the material, her expression thoughtful. "This patch," Evelyn began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion, "reminds me of a winter storm that changed everything. It was a hard time, but it taught me that even in the fiercest storms, there's a strength waiting to be found." Clara tucked her feet beneath her, the warm blanket draped around her shoulders. "What happened, Grandma?" she asked softly. Evelyn's gaze drifted to the window, where the snowflakes swirled lazily. "It was the winter of my 20th year," she began, her voice pulling Clara into the past. "A storm unlike any other descended on our town. The snow fell for days, and the winds howled like wolves. It felt as though the entire world had been swallowed by the storm." Evelyn's family lived on the edge of town, their small house nestled against the forest. The snow piled higher each day, burying fences and creeping up to the windowsills. By the second day, they realized they were completely cut off from the rest of the town. Roads were impassable, and the power lines had fallen under the weight of the ice. "At first, it felt like an adventure," Evelyn said with a faint smile. "We lit candles, built up the fire, and bundled ourselves in blankets. My father said we'd wait it out, that help would come soon. But as the days passed, the cold crept in deeper, and our supplies began to dwindle." On the fourth day, Evelyn's father announced that he needed to trek into town for supplies. The storm had eased slightly, but the journey would still be treacherous. Evelyn and her mother pleaded with him to wait, but he insisted. He couldn't risk his family going without food or firewood. "He kissed us goodbye and told us to stay by the fire," Evelyn said, her voice quieter now. "I remember watching him disappear into the white, his figure swallowed by the snow. It was the longest day of my life." The hours dragged on, the storm's intensity rising again as evening fell. Evelyn and her mother sat huddled by the fire, trying to keep each other warm and calm. But as the night deepened, worry began to seep into their hearts. "I couldn't just sit there anymore," Evelyn said. "Something in me told me I had to do something, anything, to help." She bundled herself in every layer she could find and stepped out into the storm. The cold was like a living thing, biting at her face and clawing through her clothes. She fought her way through the snow, her lantern barely illuminating the path ahead. "I didn't have a plan," Evelyn admitted. "I just knew I had to try." And then, as if by some miracle, I saw him. Her father was leaning against a tree, exhausted and half buried in snow. He'd twisted his ankle on the icy path and hadn't been able to go any farther. Evelyn's heart leapt at the sight of him, relief mingling with fear. "He smiled when he saw me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He said, 'I knew you'd come.'" With sheer determination, Evelyn helped her father back to his feet. They leaned on each other as they made their way back to the house, step by grueling step. By the time they reached the door, they were both shaking from the cold, but they were alive. "That storm tested us in ways we never expected," Evelyn said, "but it also brought us closer together. We realized how strong we could be, not just as individuals, but as a family. We faced the storm together, and that made all the difference." Clara's eyes were wide, her hands clutching the edges of her blanket. "That's so brave, Grandma. I don't know if I could have done what you did." Evelyn smiled, her hand reaching out to rest gently on Clara's. "You'd be surprised, my dear. Strength has a way of revealing itself when we need it most, and you're braver than you think." As she began stitching the dark gray patch into the quilt, Evelyn said, "This square is a reminder that even the darkest times can teach us something. They show us what we're capable of and how important it is to hold on to each other." The fabric joined the others, its somber hue a stark contrast to the brighter patches. But it was no less important, its presence a testament to the resilience and love that carried Evelyn and her family through the storm. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, leaving a quiet stillness in its wake. Inside, the warmth of the fire and the steady rhythm of Evelyn's sewing filled the room. The quilt grew, one story at a time, binding the past and present together in a tapestry of life. The little library. The warmth of the fire softened the edges of the room as Evelyn reached into her basket and selected a patch of deep purple fabric. Clara noticed the way her grandmother's eyes sparkled, as though the memory tied to this piece was a particularly cherished one. "This patch," Evelyn began, smoothing the fabric on her lap, "reminds me of a little library I discovered when I was just a girl. It became my sanctuary, a place that shaped my love for stories and words." Clara's curiosity lit up her face. "A secret library?" she asked, her voice hushed as though guarding the secret herself. Evelyn chuckled. "Not exactly secret, but hidden enough that it felt like it was all mine. Let me tell you about the summer I found it." Evelyn was 10 years old and spending the summer at her aunt's house in a quiet village nestled between rolling hills. The days were long and golden, filled with the scent of blooming flowers and the hum of bees. But Evelyn, a bookish child, often found herself yearning for something more than the outdoor games her cousins adored. "One afternoon," Evelyn began, "I wandered off while the others were playing by the stream. I heard someone mention an old, abandoned schoolhouse at the edge of the village, and my curiosity got the better of me." The schoolhouse was a small, weathered building tucked beneath a canopy of trees. Its windows were dusty, and the door creaked loudly when Evelyn pushed it open. Inside, the air was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of aged wood and something she couldn't quite place. "At first it seemed empty," Evelyn said, "but then I saw the books." The far wall of the schoolhouse was lined with shelves, each one crammed with books of all shapes and sizes. Some were old and worn, their spines cracked with age, while others looked as though they'd never been opened. Evelyn's heart raced as she stepped closer, her fingers trailing over the spines. "It felt like I'd stumbled into a treasure trove," she said, her voice filled with wonder. I pulled a book from the shelf and sat down right there on the floor, completely lost in its pages. The hours slipped away unnoticed as Evelyn explored the library. She found stories of far-off lands, poetry that sang to her heart, and books filled with illustrations that seemed to leap off the page. The little library became her refuge, a place where she could escape the world and let her imagination soar. I went back every day that summer, Evelyn told Clara. Sometimes I'd bring a sandwich and sit outside to read under the trees. Other times I'd lose myself in the quiet of the schoolhouse, surrounded by the soft whispers of the pages. One afternoon, Evelyn discovered a small notebook tucked among the books. Its pages were filled with handwritten notes, sketches, and poetry. The name M.W. was scribbled on the inside cover. I never found out who M.W. was, Evelyn said, but their words inspired me. It was as though they'd left little pieces of themselves behind, waiting for someone to find them. Clara's eyes were wide with fascination. "Did you tell anyone about the library?" she asked. Evelyn shook her head. "I didn't want to share it, not then. It felt too special, like it belonged to me and the books alone. But that summer, I learned how powerful stories could be. They opened my mind to new possibilities and taught me that there's magic in the written word." As she began sewing the purple patch into the quilt, Evelyn said, "This square is for that little library, for the stories that shaped me and the wonder they brought into my life. It's a reminder to always seek out the hidden treasures in the world." Clara leaned closer, watching her grandmother's hands work. "I hope I find a place like that one day," she said softly. Evelyn smiled, her gaze warm and knowing. "You will, my dear. And when you do, it will feel like coming home." Outside, the night deepened, the stars twinkling in the clear winter sky. Inside, the quilt grew steadily, each patch a story waiting to be passed down. The little library's memory was stitched into its fabric, a piece of Evelyn's heart preserved for generations to come. The gift of hands. The fire's glow bathed the room in a soft amber light, as Evelyn reached into her basket and pulled out a patch of cream-colored fabric. Clara watched as her grandmother ran her fingers over the smooth cloth, her expression touched with a tender kind of nostalgia. "This patch," Evelyn began, her voice steady and warm, "reminds me of the women who taught me everything I know about sewing, knitting, and crafting. It's a story of the hands that shaped me and how their gifts became mine to carry forward." Clara leaned in closer, curiosity brimming in her eyes. "Who taught you, Grandma? Was it your mother?" Evelyn nodded, her lips curving into a gentle smile. "Yes, my mother and my grandmother. They were both remarkable women, each with her own way of working magic with needle and thread. Let me tell you about the summer I truly learned what it meant to create something with my hands." Evelyn was just 12 years old, a quiet and observant child who often lingered in the corners of rooms, watching her mother and grandmother work. That summer, her family stayed at her grandmother's house in the countryside, a place filled with the scent of lavender and the sound of birdsong. "My grandmother, Margaret, had a gift for quilting," Evelyn said. "Her hands were weathered but steady, and her stitches were so precise they looked as though they'd been drawn by an artist. My mother, on the other hand, was a dreamer. She loved to experiment with colors and patterns, letting her imagination guide her. One sunny morning, as Evelyn sat on the porch watching the two women sew, her grandmother beckoned her over. "Come here, child," she'd said, patting the seat beside her. "It's time you learned how to put your heart into fabric." Evelyn's small hands had trembled as her grandmother handed her a needle and thread. "Start small," Margaret had said. "You're not stitching just fabric. You're stitching memories, love, and strength. Every thread tells a story." At first, Evelyn's stitches were uneven, and her frustration bubbled over more than once. But her mother would lean in, her laughter light as the summer breeze. "It's not about being perfect," she'd said. "It's about putting yourself into it. Let your hands speak for you." Over the weeks that followed, Evelyn's hands grew steadier. She learned how to sew small squares together, creating patterns that pleased her eyes and warmed her heart. Her mother and grandmother worked alongside her, their voices weaving stories as their hands wove fabric. "Those days on the porch," Evelyn said to Clara, taught me more than just sewing. They taught me patience, resilience, and the joy of creating something from nothing. My grandmother used to say that hands have their own language, one that speaks through the things they make. Evelyn's first quilt had been a simple one, made of mismatched squares and uneven stitches. But when she held it up, her grandmother had smiled with pride. That, she'd said, is a masterpiece, because it carries your heart in every stitch. Clara's eyes sparkled as she listened. "Do you still have that quilt, Grandma?" she asked. Evelyn's smile turned wistful. "I do. It's upstairs in the cedar chest alongside so many others. It's not the prettiest, but it's one of the most precious things I own. It reminds me of the hands that guided mine and the stories they shared as we worked." She began sewing the cream-colored patch into the growing quilt on her lap. "This square is for my mother and grandmother," she said softly. "For the women who taught me to see beauty in the simplest things and to create something lasting with my hands." Clara watched the needle move through the fabric, her heart full of admiration. "I want to learn," she said suddenly. "Will you teach me, Grandma?" Evelyn looked up, her eyes shining. "Nothing would make me happier, my dear. One day you'll add your own patch to this quilt, and your hands will speak for themselves." Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the echoes of generations past. Inside, Evelyn and Clara sat together, bound by the stories they shared and the stitches they wove into the quilt, one memory at a time. The unspoken goodbye. The fire burned low, casting a soft glow over the room as Evelyn pulled a square of midnight blue fabric from her basket. Clara noticed the way her grandmother's hands lingered on the material, as though it carried a weight beyond its texture. "This patch," Evelyn began quietly, her voice tinged with a bittersweet note, "reminds me of a time when the quilt was more than comfort. It became a source of solace in a moment of loss." Clara leaned in closer, her heart aching at the emotion in her grandmother's words. "Who did you lose, Grandma?" she asked gently. Evelyn's eyes lifted to the window where the snowflakes swirled softly against the darkening sky. "Your great-grandfather, Henry," she said. "Saying goodbye to him was the hardest thing I've ever done." Evelyn was in her early 60s when Henry fell ill. They had shared decades together, building a life filled with love, laughter, and the quiet joys of everyday moments. When Henry's health began to fail, the rhythm of their days shifted. The once strong man who had swept her off her feet at the winter dance grew weaker, and Evelyn found herself becoming his caregiver. "It was a slow goodbye," Evelyn said, her voice steady but soft. "Each day, a little more of him slipped away. But he never lost his kindness, his humor, or his love for me. Even in his final days, he found ways to make me smile." One cold winter evening, as Henry rested in his favorite armchair by the fire, Evelyn sat beside him, working on a quilt she'd started when they were first married. The patches told the story of their life together, their first home, the births of their children, and the many winters they'd spent by the fire, just like this one. "That night, he asked me to read to him," Evelyn said, her gaze distant. "It was a book of poems he'd given me on our first anniversary. His favorite poem was marked with a ribbon, and as I read it aloud, I could see how much it meant to him." Evelyn paused, her hand brushing the midnight blue fabric. "After I finished, he took my hand and said, 'I hope you'll remember me like this, in the quiet, with the firelight, and with all the love we've shared.'" Tears welled in Clara's eyes as she listened, imagining the profound bond her grandparents had shared. "He sounds like he was wonderful," she whispered. Evelyn smiled, though her eyes glistened. "He was, my dear, and he still is in my heart. The morning he passed, I wrapped myself in that quilt. It was as though he'd left a part of himself in it, keeping me warm when I needed it most." After Henry's passing, Evelyn had poured her grief into her sewing, creating patches for every moment she wanted to hold on to. The midnight blue square she held now represented the peace she'd found in those quiet hours by the fire, letting her memories guide her stitches. "This patch is a reminder," Evelyn said, her voice soft but firm, "that even in loss, we carry the people we love with us. They're in our memories, our stories, and the things they leave behind." Clara wiped at her cheeks, her heart heavy yet full of admiration for her grandmother's strength. "Do you think he'd be proud of this quilt?" she asked. Evelyn's smile widened, warm and sure. "Oh, I know he would be. Henry always believed in the beauty of small, meaningful things. This quilt, it's a reflection of the life we built together." As Evelyn stitched the midnight blue patch into place, Clara reached out to touch the quilt, feeling the layers of fabric beneath her fingertips. "I think he'd be proud of you too," she said softly. Evelyn's eyes met Clara's, and in that moment, a deep understanding passed between them. "Thank you, my dear," she said. "And one day, when you face your own goodbyes, I hope this quilt will remind you of the strength and love that carries us through." Outside, the night deepened, the snow settling like a blanket over the world. Inside, the quilt grew larger, holding within it a tapestry of love, loss, and the unspoken goodbyes that linger in every life. Threads of the present. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting a golden glow over the room. The quilt, now nearly complete, rested across Evelyn's lap. Its patches, each one stitched with care, formed a tapestry of her life's most cherished moments. Clara, seated on the rug near her grandmother's feet, gazed at the quilt in awe, her fingers tracing the edges of the patches as though they might whisper secrets from the past. "It's beautiful, Grandma," Clara said, her voice full of admiration. "Every piece feels alive, like it's telling its own story." Evelyn smiled down at her granddaughter. "That's because it is, my dear. This quilt is a part of me, just as much as the memories it holds, but there's something missing." Clara tilted her head, curiosity lighting her eyes. "What's missing?" Evelyn reached into her sewing basket and pulled out a small bundle of fabric. It was a soft lavender square, the color rich and warm. "This," she said, holding it out to Clara. "I want you to add the final patch." Clara blinked, her hand hovering over the fabric as though it were something fragile. "Me? But I don't know how to sew like you do." "That doesn't matter," Evelyn said gently. "What matters is that this patch will be yours, a piece of you added to the stories of this quilt. It will make it complete." Clara hesitated for a moment, then nodded. She took the fabric from her grandmother's hands, her fingers brushing over its soft surface. "What should I sew?" she asked. Evelyn gestured to the quilt. "What story do you want to tell, Clara? Think about a moment, a memory, or a feeling that's important to you. Something that you want to carry forward, to share with the future." Clara sat quietly for a moment, her gaze fixed on the lavender square. Then her face brightened. "I know," she said, determination in her voice. With Evelyn's guidance, Clara threaded a needle and began stitching. Her hands were small and unsteady, but Evelyn's voice was a constant source of encouragement. "Take your time," she said. "Each stitch is a step, and each step is a story." Clara's design took shape slowly but surely, a simple heart stitched with uneven lines but filled with love. As she worked, she talked about the things she cherished, the evenings spent listening to her grandmother's stories, the warmth of the fire, and the comfort of being wrapped in the quilt's embrace. "This heart is for you, Grandma," Clara said as she finished the last stitch. "For everything you've shared with me, for all the love you've given." Evelyn's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she took the quilt in her hands, running her fingers over Clara's patch. "It's perfect," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "And now, the quilt is complete." Together, they spread the quilt out across the couch, marveling at its beauty. The patches, stitched across decades, seemed to glow with life. Each one was a testament to the moments that had shaped Evelyn's journey, and now Clara's story had become a part of it. "This quilt," Evelyn said softly, is a reminder that our stories never end. They weave into the lives of those we love, continuing through every patch, every thread. And one day, Clara, you'll add even more patches, telling the stories of your own life. Clara leaned against her grandmother, her heart full. I promise, Grandma, I'll keep it safe and I'll keep adding to it. Just like you did. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in quiet peace. Inside, the quilt lay spread before them, a symbol of love, resilience, and the threads that bind generations together. Evelyn and Clara sat side by side, their hands intertwined, as the warmth of the fire and the stories of the quilt wrapped them in a timeless embrace. A winter's embrace. The snow fell gently outside the window, blanketing the world in a serene white stillness. Inside the cottage, the fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a soft warmth over the room. Evelyn sat back in her armchair, her hands resting on the completed quilt that now covered her lap. Clara was nestled beside her, her head resting on her grandmother's shoulder, lulled by the soft glow of the room and the steady rhythm of Evelyn's voice. It's finished, Clara whispered, her voice filled with awe. The quilt is finally complete. Evelyn smiled, her eyes glistening with a mixture of pride and nostalgia. Yes, my dear, it's more than just a quilt now. It's a story, one that holds the heart of our family. Clara reached out, her fingers tracing the patches. She paused at the lavender square she had stitched earlier, the uneven heart standing out against the other intricate designs. It feels like all the stories we've shared are alive in this quilt, she said softly. Evelyn placed a gentle hand over Clara's. That's because they are. Every stitch, every patch carries a memory, a moment, and now it carries your story too. The room seemed to grow quieter, as if the quilt itself commanded a reverent hush. Clara's fingers lingered over a patch of golden fabric. This one's from your story about Lila, isn't it? She asked. Evelyn's lips curled into a soft smile. Yes. Lila and I sewed that quilt together on a cold winter's night, and it carried the warmth of friendship to someone who needed it most. That golden square reminds me of her laughter, of how her light brightened the darkest evenings. Clara moved to another patch, this one a deep midnight blue. And this one? This was Grandpa Henry's, wasn't it? Evelyn nodded, her voice quiet but steady. Yes, my dear. That was the night we read poetry together by the fire. It was the last time he asked me to read to him, and that patch holds the memory of his voice, his love, and the life we shared. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the quilt grounding them in the present while connecting them to the past. Evelyn's thoughts drifted to the women who had come before her, to her mother and grandmother, and to all the lessons in love that had been passed down through the years. You know, Evelyn began, her voice soft, this quilt isn't just for us. It's for the future, for those who will come after us. One day, Clara, you'll share these stories with your children or grandchildren. You'll add your own patches, and this quilt will keep growing, just as our family has. Clara looked up at her grandmother, her young face glowing with a newfound sense of responsibility. I promise, Grandma, I'll keep it safe. And I'll keep adding to it, so it can carry our stories forward. Evelyn leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to Clara's forehead. That's all I could ever hope for, my dear. This quilt is a reminder that no matter where life takes us, we are always connected by the threads of love and memory. Clara shifted beneath the quilt, wrapping it around herself as though it were a shield. I wonder what stories I'll add, she mused aloud, her voice tinged with wonder. Maybe about the adventures I'll have, or the people I'll meet. Do you think they'll be as magical as yours? Evelyn chuckled softly, the sound warm and soothing. Oh, Clara, every story is magical in its own way. The smallest moments often hold the greatest beauty. A quiet morning in the garden, a shared meal with someone you love, even a walk in the snow. These are the moments that become patches on our quilts. The room grew quieter as the firelight dimmed, Clara yawned, the day's excitement giving way to the comfort of sleep. Evelyn guided her granddaughter to the couch and draped the quilt over her small frame. Clara curled beneath it, her breath slowing as she drifted into a peaceful slumber. Evelyn stood for a moment, gazing down at Clara. Her heart swelled with a mix of love and gratitude. The quilt, with its stories and stitches, seemed to glow in the dim light, a tangible representation of everything she held dear. Moving to the window, Evelyn looked out at the snow-covered world. The stars twinkled above, their light steady and reassuring. She thought of Henry, of her mother and grandmother, and of all the moments that had brought her to this place. She whispered a quiet thank you to the past and a hopeful promise to the future. Returning to her chair, Evelyn sat down and picked up her knitting needles. Though the quilt was finished, her hands weren't ready to rest. She began to knit a small square, humming softly to herself as the night deepened. The cottage settled into stillness, the only sounds the soft crackle of the embers and the rhythmic clicking of Evelyn's needles. Outside, the snow continued to fall, wrapping the world in a gentle embrace. Inside, the quilt lay warm and complete, its stories waiting to be told again, its threads a testament to the enduring power of love and connection. Evelyn's thoughts turned to Clara once more. She imagined the young girl growing up, adding her own stories to the quilt. In her heart, Evelyn knew the quilt would live on, not just as a blanket, but as a legacy, a piece of their family that would carry their love through generations. Thank you for joining us on Story Planet. If tonight's tale brought you comfort or made you feel the warmth of family and love, consider giving it a thumbs up. If you feel the story could soothe someone else, feel free to share it with friends and family. Don't forget to subscribe to be part of our daily journey into relaxing stories, designed to bring you peace and sweet dreams. Wishing you a restful night and a cozy sleep. Sweet dreams.